On the 1st of January 1945, near to Chenogne, in Belgium, around 80 German prisoners of war were led out to their executions. The men were stood gathered together, and then their American captors turned a machine gun on them. This mass execution took place during the Battle of the Bulge, and it was a war crime. The men who were executed, despite the fact they were enemy combatants, were technically prisoners of war, and they were Wehrmacht and some SS enemy soldiers. The fighting during the Ardennes offensive was very rough, and the US forces, who were dug in, had to suffer with a huge amount of terror. Artillery was fired into their positions, and many succumbed to their deaths inside of their foxholes in the snow. But the executions of the German soldiers that day were in response to another mass killing, and it was revenge or vengeance. In this video we look at the executions of the German soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Battle of the Bulge, or the Ardennes Offensive, began on the 16th of December 1944, and it was launched by the Germans through the densely forested Ardennes region. The plan was for the offensive to stop the Allied use of the port of Antwerp and to split the Allied lines. Hitler dreamed that his forces would encircle and destroy the four Allied armies, and then force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace treaty. The reality was that it was Hitler's last costly roll of the dice. The Germans achieved a surprise attack when the offensive began, and they took advantage of the weather, and over 410,000 men were committed to the attack by the German forces. This was a time in which supplies were scarce also, as Allied heavy bombing campaigns and raids over Germany had heavily damaged the ability for the Germans to produce planes and vital supplies. The Ardennes offensive would severely deplete the German armed forces, but the fighting in the snowy forests was also incredibly costly for the Allies. There were around 80,000 casualties and at least 9,000 were killed for the US. The Battle of the Bulge, as it was known, was the largest and deadliest single battle that the Americans were involved in during World War II, and it was the last major offensive attempted by the Axis. A day after the Ardennes offensive began, the German soldiers committed a terrible massacre and mass execution of American prisoners of war at the Ardennes crossroads near to the town of Malmedy. This was known as the Malmedy Massacre. Soldiers of Kampfgruppe Peiper had rounded up 84 US servicemen who had surrendered following a brief battle. The Waffen-SS men had gathered the Americans in a farmer's field, and they were then massacred by machine gun fire. The Waffen-SS soldiers then, after this, went amongst the corpses and ensured everyone was dead, giving coup de grace gunshots to the head. It wasn't long before news of this war crime spread amongst the American forces, and it caused a huge amount of anger, and there was an immediate need for revenge. Different groups of American forces began to think of how they could get at their German enemy, and the 328th Infantry Regiment issued orders that there would be, quote, no SS troops or paratroopers who will be taken prisoner of war. Instead they will be shot and executed on sight. This led to a massacre and execution near to the settlement of Chenogne. 2 weeks later, on the 1st of January 1945, members of the Führerbegleiter Brigade and the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division were gathered to be executed. One man who witnessed the executions of these Germans stated that, I quote, some of the boys had the prisoners line up. I knew they were going to shoot them, and I hated this business. They marched the prisoners back up the hill to murder them with the rest of the prisoners we had secured that morning. As we were going up the hill out of town, I know some of our boys were lining up German prisoners in the fields on both sides of the road. There must have been 25 or 30 German boys in each group. Machine guns were being set up. These boys were to be machine gunned and murdered. We were committing the same crimes we were now accusing the Japanese and Germans of doing. Going back down the road into town, I looked into the fields where the German boys had been shot. Dark, lifeless forms lay in the snow. What that quote tells us is that not all American soldiers were happy with witnessing this sort of execution. The German prisoners were lined up in fields, and their machine guns were set up, and the Germans were executed and shot in cold blood. Amongst some of the US soldiers, they believed that actions like the Chenogne Massacre, as it became known, made them no better than their enemies, and some believe that this sort of execution and massacre was actually a stain on their army and war efforts. It's presumed that the victims of the execution were buried in mass graves in the snow-covered ground. But what came next was a shocking cover-up, and the United States government attempted to hide what really happened. They did not want information getting out about their forces, and that they had carried out such a massacre of unarmed enemy combatants who were technically prisoners of war. The US government claimed, I quote, "It is probable that Germans who attempted to surrender in the days immediately after the 17th of December ran a greater risk of being executed because of the previous massacre." They also said that, I quote, "There is no evidence that American troops took advantage of orders, implicit in or explicit, to kill their SS prisoners." But of course this was not true. In General George S. Patton's war diary, dated the 4th of January 1945, he mentions the massacre and stated that, I quote, "also murdered 50 of Germans. I hope we can conceal this." So senior figures within the American army knew exactly what had happened. This wasn't the only example of this though, as a 90th Infantry Division executed Waffen-SS prisoners in such a systematic manner late in December 1944 that headquarters had to issue express orders to take Waffen-SS soldiers alive so they could be able to obtain information from them. So the American military hierarchy did know that there was a growing trend amongst American forces to execute SS soldiers. To these men, the SS represented the most ardent Nazis and the most virulent of soldiers, and they were also considered very dangerous. There were other actions carried out by individual soldiers, in which smaller executions of SS soldiers also occurred. The execution of around 80 German men at Chenogne was symbolic, as it was one soldier for mostly every American soldier who was executed at Malmedy. Later, other soldiers would, in declassified files, state of their experiences witnessing the execution. A soldier named Max Cohen later claimed that he saw roughly 70 German prisoners machine-gunned by the 11th Armoured Division, and later Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered an investigation into the massacre, but the men of the 11th Armoured refused to cooperate, and they claimed it was too late in the war. The execution of the roughly 80 German soldiers that took place near to Chenogne was in direct response to the massacre that took place weeks before. It was a war crime, and was something that should have been punished at the end of the conflict, but nothing ever took place with regards to this. There was a cover-up at the end of the conflict also, and there is still much more today that needs to be uncovered about the actions that occurred on that day on January the 1st, 1945. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.